excited to introduce our speaker to talk about a topic that I know I need to hear about because we have so many distractions in our lives. And so Dr. Jeffrey Roof from Marshall University, he's the chair of our Religious Studies program, is going to talk to us today about mindfulness. So take it away. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. I'm going to move around a lot because when I talk, I cannot stay attached to this lecture, so I gave myself a chair unless, in case I get tired. Welcome. Thanks for coming today. And the topic of mindfulness has been of interest in the Western world for more than 100 years, actually. But it's been particularly of interest since probably the 1960s or 70s. And I'm going to talk about probably 4 or 5 different things over the next 30 or 40 minutes. And I'm going to start with what it is. One of the things I've learned from students over the years is that if you spend all the beginning point talking about the history of stuff and the technical stuff, they all fall asleep or get distracted before you ever actually get to what you're supposed to be talking about. So I'm going to start with what I'm talking about, and then we'll go back and fill in some blanks about where it comes from and what's going on. Simply speaking, I'll sort of highlight a couple of those points. Mindfulness is a term that's an a modern English translation of an ancient Sanskrit term, which comes from India. And it's smarana, which means to remember, to not forget. It has the total meanings of that word are even richer than that. And so a number of philosophical and religious traditions from ancient and classical India have this set of practices that people do that's about what you're not supposed to forget, what you have to pay attention to, and what you need to be able to remember in order to live a meaningful human life. And these concepts became of interest internationally, again, over 100 years ago. But in the 1960s and 70s, psychology and medicine got really interested in these topics. And so in America in particular, there's been a mindfulness movement that was well established and spread out into culture by the 1980s. And the roots of that go back a little bit later. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that stuff in the sort of second point of my talk. But I want to start with is like, what is it? Because I notice in pop culture, from film to television to media, that people talk about mindfulness or say be mindful. And it's interesting, I was talking to an addiction recovery group recently, and one of the guys said about halfway through, I stopped for questions, and he said, man, I'm glad you told us what it is, because everybody's telling me to be mindful, and I'm trying to learn this mindfulness, but I actually don't know how to be mindful. I don't know what that means. And so I said, so that was helpful. And so I've got a list of phrases that I use, and one of them might catch your attention, and another one might catch another person's attention. And so I use this collection of phrases to try to get 18 to 24-year-olds to pay attention to what I'm saying. And the first one is, pay attention. Pay attention. Pay attention. I once taught a 16-week class at Marshall in Buddhism, of which some of this topic and subject matter was an important aspect of the class. And there was a kid who was a good student, and he was one of those kids that you always notice real quick because he always wore like a tie, and he was very well dressed and very polite and a good student. And he asked good questions, and he was sort of attentive throughout the class. And maybe the second to the last day of class, he did this with his hands on his desk. It was like loud enough to where it kind of echoed, and he was like, "Pay attention. That's all you've been teaching us all semester long. Pay attention." And I said, yeah. Which is what I told you on the first day. He says, well, no, I just got it. So number one idea of mindfulness is not mystical, it's not philosophical, it's very, very ordinary. And that is, if you don't pay attention, you will miss things. And that is, if you don't pay attention to your body, you might find yourself shockingly hungry before you realize it. you might find yourself exhausted and dropping off to sleep. And nobody suddenly gets sleepy or hungry or tired. Our body gives us all kinds of responses. And again, you guys are not the 18-year-old crowd, so much of this, many things that I'm going to say today, you're going to go, yeah, I've learned that over the course of my life. But sort of putting them all together in one place is that if you've ever eaten when you were not hungry, if you've ever not eaten when you were hungry, if you've ever not slept when you were sleepy or slept when you weren't sleepy, and you can just go through, if you ever find yourself holding your breath, you're getting nervous and lightheaded, and you're like, standard stress and anxiety response. And so one of the things that these traditions teach us to pay attention to is just the signals that our body is giving us. Because if we're inattentive to those things, we will not operate in a kind of optimal way. My sort of next phrase is listen. And that's a thing that we've all been told since we were small children. I've got a 5-year-old. She just started kindergarten today. And so it's like, listen to me. So we all know that. We know that one too. But listening in this mindfulness movement is something more like you got to listen to yourself, you got to listen to other people, you've got to care, because that's actually part of listening. So actually caring about who's speaking to you or what's being said is part of actually being able to listen properly. And listening includes things like not making up your mind ahead of time, which is nearly impossible for all of us all the time. We typically go into things with an idea about sort of how it's going to go, or we start to hear something and we either embrace it because it's something we already think, or we reject it because it's something that we already don't believe in. And so one of the fundamental lessons, and this actually comes from a bunch of ancient and classical philosophical traditions, both East and West, is that not making up your mind ahead of time is an incredibly important skill set, so that you can actually understand what's being expressed to you, or what you're reading, or what you're encountering. We find it in the Christian tradition, the Confucian tradition of China, the Taoist tradition, all these ancient Indian traditions. There's Socrates in the ancient West, super famous for saying, pay attention and don't make up your mind ahead of time. So that kind of thing is part of this mindfulness training and the concepts associated with mindfulness. The next one is, let's see. Yeah, here's the one that's in pop culture everywhere, and that is be here in the present moment. Be present to this moment. And that's one of the ones who, upon initial training, people go like, oh, what? And this focus on the present moment is basically built up out of the idea that everything in life starts small. And if you pay attention to what you need to be doing right now, another way to say this is first things first, is that if you pay attention to where you are and what you're doing, and you put focus, energy, and attention into that activity, then what's going to come an hour from now or 3 weeks from now will also take care of themselves. Not because it's going to happen magically, but it's because that's the only way you can actually get there, by paying attention to right now, what you're doing and how you're doing it. And if you take care of small tasks, when they're small, they don't grow into big tasks. And so, and this is considered a kind of response or a cure to things like procrastination, denial, putting off hard things. In fact, one of the things that happens in any kind of busy office life, or home life for that matter, is that we got something big we need to deal with, so we go clean the house first.
Yeah.
Because we just want to do something that we can, that's ordered and we can accomplish. It's like, I'm going to go out and organize my tools in the garage because, I can do that in the next hour, until I take on this bigger task. And the mindfulness exercises say, if you got a big task and that's your present moment, then start that big task. Don't put off tasks. And again, this is going to start sounding like aphorisms that we've heard our whole life from a lot of different traditions, from Shakespeare to the Bible to Mark Twain, and that is, do what needs to be done immediately. And that's what being present to your present moment means. It also means the thing like if someone's talking to you, listen to them. Pay attention to what they're talking about. Or if, and this is also, all of this stuff, one of the reasons this became interesting to medicine and psychology is because all the underlying concepts and metaphors of this mindfulness stuff are actually medical. It's their basic way of thinking. They think about that there is an illness or an imbalance and it needs to be responded to by a therapy. And so this is the rational structure of mindfulness, is that it's intentionally a therapeutic kind of response to a problem. And in the ancient traditions, they really basically said that human beings have three problems. And that is, we have things that we're obsessed with, those are the things that attract us, and we'll reorganize our lives around our obsessions. And then we have the things that we are repulsed by, or we are averse to. Those are our fears, or our hatreds, or our biases, and we try to keep those away. And then the other thing is not understanding what's going on, or what's broadly thought of is just ignorance, not seeing things clearly. And so these traditions sort of approach those very practical, ordinary human things about there's things that we want, there's things that we don't want, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't know, or we don't understand clearly. And that all of that together, if we're not paying attention, if we're not attentive to our lives and what we're doing, all of that stuff will get incredibly mixed up and complicated. And so it basically works like this. A typical attraction can be, I want to provide for my family. So all of us can say, oh yeah, well that's a good goal. That's a good one. But if I find myself so attracted to that goal that I don't spend any time with my family because I've sort of become a workaholic, which happened to me early in my career. I mean, I like what I do, so it's easy, and you can rationalize that. Then you're not paying attention to certain kinds of things that are important because you got too attracted to something and it wasn't kept in balance with sort of all the things that are in other parts of life. An aversion, that's pretty easy. We all have fears, and we all have things that we're biased about, things that we just don't like, and we try to keep those away as much as possible. And unfortunately, that's not really how life works, because the things we don't like are intermixed with all the things that we do like. And then the ignorance issue is, the typical cure for that is that you guys are here today. Not at this talk in particular, or for me in particular, but if people treat life as a lifelong learning activity, in Leonardo da Vinci's journals, he writes all the time about sort of how you stay active as a learner, and he's got really interesting things to say, like be curious, have the curiosity as a child, or do unfamiliar things. And we think like, oh, I thought that was from the self-help book that I just read. Yeah, they probably got it. Or Plato, because he says stuff like that as well. The connection here is that everything that I'm talking about today is, according to these traditions, their focus in this way about mindfulness is ordinary life. Not special cases, not unusual circumstances, but when are you supposed to pay attention? In your ordinary life. Because most of us actually know quite well to pay attention when things are big. So if we have a major illness in the family, or we get a great promotion at work, really easy for us to celebrate the good times and to sort of steel ourselves to carry and deal with the bad times. We actually know that. We pay pretty good attention when sort of things are on the line. But it's all the little things that are hard to keep in mind and pay attention to. And this kind of traditional way of looking at things pays attention to this. Two points that kind of go together. One of them is do one thing at a time. It's a standard practice out of this tradition. And that is the opposite of mostly what our society delivers us, both just in terms of family and friends and the complexity, the quick moving nature of our economy, our society, our work, our play. It's all mixed together and it's all very complicated. And when my students are getting their resumes or their CVs ready to sort of go on to grad school or go out onto the job market, you know, all the things that they look at says, you know, make sure to have a lot of stuff in there about that you can multitask. And that's been a catchphrase at least since the 80s. And according to the mindfulness tradition, multitasking is bad for you for several reasons. One, you can't actually do it. That's not actually how your brain works or your body. So first off, your brain, because what happens if you do multitasking, you're actually giving something your attention, and then you stop giving it attention, and you get something else right beside it your attention. And so you can only pay attention to one thing at a time. And if you think that you can pay attention to a lot of things at the same time, then it's just because you're really good at switching fast. And we get good at it. I mean, that's part of the flexible nature of a human being, is that we can take up things and learn them as habits and skills, and we can manage them and get good at them. But one of them is that you cannot actually do more than one thing at a time, not according to the way your brain works. And then the other one is if you do 5 tasks at the same time, as opposed to 1 task at a time, you won't do that 1 task 5 times better. You'll do it infinitely better, geometrically better. So because if you split your attention, your productivity drops. This is even in a creative act or something you like. It's not just a work thing. This is sort of a life thing. If your attention is scattered across multiple things, and all of us know this intuitively, because when we get really busy and it's stressful and things are going on, is that we start forgetting stuff that we don't ever forget otherwise. And that's because you can't pay attention to all that stuff at the same time. You can't keep it in your focus. And then my favorite phrase out of all of these phrases is one that I learned from this kind of counterculture Zen center in Northern California some years ago, where I went and did a seminar. And it is, how you do anything is how you do everything.
Say it again.
How you do anything is how you do everything. And I have been thinking about this phrase for 20 years because it's really interesting. Because what it says is that if you practice, say, phoning it in and doing things halfway for things that you've decided in advance, so see how these things build on each other, wasn't important, then you'll be mediocre in that kind of stuff. But of course, that's what you're practicing. You're practicing being mediocre. And you will get better at what you practice. So if you practice not paying attention to what you're doing multiple things at a time, you will get better at it. But that means that's your practice. So your habits are, to be great at doing things halfway. Of all college students I've had over all the years, I think about how many great, wonderful people and wonderful students I've had that have read half of a bunch of really good books. And I always tell them that if you just read the whole thing, you don't need to read as many. But it's other things I tell my students. If you practice watching 8 hours straight of Netflix, you'll get better at it. You'll prefer it to other activities. You'll cancel something you've got over here to do this over here. And so the reason how you do anything is how you do everything, is because whatever you're guiding the majority of your guiding practices are. So if the majority of your guiding practices are to be late and to do things halfway and to not pay attention, you will actually get good at that. And you won't, and you'll be frustrated with yourself when you're trying to pay attention to stuff and like, why can't I pay attention to this? It's like, well, you've built all these habits of not paying attention. And this is worth knowing because our society has a subculture that's pervasive of self-criticism that's really unfair because it's not actually how we work as people. And that is, we tend to pick on ourselves when we're poor at something. And we think that we should have more discipline or more, you know, we've got all these decades and decades and decades of ways to make ourselves feel bad about what we're not good at. But it's because we have a society and we have a set of practices that have also that have calculated and systematically and step by step by step, we've built habits that makes it hard for us to pay attention to a single thing at a time, to block everything out and to make things simpler. And so we're not distracted and confused and stressed out and anxious because we're bad people or weak people. That's just not how it works, actually. We're that way because we've practiced being distracted, hyper-aware. I'm going to shift over to a piece of science here, and that is, if you think about evolutionary brain psychology, human beings not paying attention to one thing at a time, it has survival value. So the reason we have this problem as a human being is because we're built this way, and that is we have both the ability to pay attention and we have the ability to be hypervigilant. And those two things are opposite of each other. Hypervigilance is like this, and that is, I want to get some berries off this tree right here, and I get eaten by a lion while I was stuffing my mouth full of cherries. So, we have a history as a creature of sort of like, because, you know, our eyes are only on one side of our head. So unlike a horse, you know, which can see almost 365 degrees, we can only see on this side of our head. So, which is the basis of distractibility. It is a survival trait to be hypervigilant. If you're not hypervigilant, when you're crossing the street, you can get hit by a car. If you're not hypervigilant whenever you're going to your car in a dark parking lot late at night, that's dangerous. And so this kind of not paying attention to any one thing at a time and just sort of being aware of peripheral things, looking here, looking there, that's useful to us. Here's the problem, though, is we respond to everyday activities as if it's a tiger or a lion about to do this. We're running 5 minutes late to work, and we're experiencing the cold sweat, stomach ache, and anxiety as if we were being chased by a tiger. And so we've got our survival instinct, that hypervigilant, diffused attention. We've got it turned on all the time, and we have the gain turned all the way up. And this also relates to all kinds of social, political anxieties, psychological anxieties. It's this kind of hypervigilance makes us afraid of everything because we're too keyed up all the time. We also eat and drink things that exaggerate this. If you love caffeine products and you have a lot of them every day, you can. Why do we do that? It's because we're underslept. And we're skipping meals, and we've got a lot of work to do. And so, say, you know, we drink an extra cup of coffee, and that sort of jitteriness, it makes us better. Caffeine does help your attention. It's attention enhancing, but it also makes us jittery. And so, this natural tendency then gets exaggerated further. Or if it's the case of my children, if they have any sugar whatsoever, it's just anthropology at home. I can start making field notes. Interesting behavior of the human being. I mean, it's astounding. And so we're not distractible and needing to learn attention because we're bad people, or we're stupid people, or we're incapable people, or we don't have enough discipline. It's because we have two contradictory parts that in their right use have a goal and a role in our lives, and that is being distractible in an environment, being able to pay attention to a lot of things at the same time. That's useful, unless you're doing it all the time. And being able to pay attention to one thing at a time is useful, unless you're trying to cross the street or something like that. The next one, it's really my generation that has been fascinated with Star Wars. Maybe some of you have seen those movies, but the next one is be mindful of your feelings, which, if you're a Star Wars fan, would include also young Skywalker, because it's a quote from Yoda that at 10 years old I was fascinated. But be mindful of your feelings, and this is a really complicated one and deep one, and that is because if we find ourselves terribly frightened or terribly angry, and are not in a life, I'm not talking about a life-threatening circumstance, I'm talking about more in the day-to-day ways. If we find ourselves very fearful or paranoid or angry, explosively, any of those kinds of emotions, then we've probably systematically ignored multiple emotional warning messages leading up to that. If a person bursts into anger, and they're not usually a hot-tempered person, then that built up over a day or multiple days because there's something in their life they're not paying attention to, that they're not trying to, maybe they can't, or maybe it's embarrassing, or it's uncomfortable, or maybe it's in a family situation where it's just kind of hard to deal with it, or maybe they're just too busy or too underslept or whatever. And so paying attention to our feelings is a kind of mindfulness diagnostic criteria, which is about if we want to think clearly, be able to listen and learn, we need to be self-aware about how we're feeling in this present moment. And that is not a childish thing. It's not a for girls thing. That's one of the things I hear from the students, is that the feeling stuff is really a girl thing and guys don't. And no, it's a human being thing. If you have a limbic system, you have a whole bunch of feelings. And if you don't know what they are, and you're not aware of them, they will get all tangled up with everything you're doing. And it will be hard to accomplish either personal goals like happiness and growth, or professional goals like success. If you don't know what your feelings are, and you're not in touch with them, it's a kind of harm to yourself. Now I want to get to this meaning of the word that comes from the ancient Sanskrit word that really means to memory or to remember. And that is, so remember what? One of these is remember what's important. It's another aspect of first things first. If you are happy, healthy, living your life well, and you're always worrying about things, you're not remembering what life you actually have. Remembering, keeping goals in mind. And in setting goals, actually, that's an attention issue. So if you have no goals, you're not really paying attention that you're a human being needing to live a life. That's a matter of focus, which if you're distracted, it's hard to be focused. And if you're distracted and unfocused, it's hard to know what you're supposed to do next. And we carry this on for our whole lives. It starts in childhood and it goes all the way through the entirety of our lives, is that if we don't have goals, we don't remember what is important, most important to us, then we will get distracted. And one of the biggest places we'll get distracted there is we'll end up doing stuff that other people want us to do. So if we don't know what our first thing first is, then we'll get caught up in what our children need, or our friends need, or our siblings need, or our bosses need, or my neighbor needs. You just end up doing stuff for other people, which is charitable and nice, and oftentimes is not incompatible with living your life meaningfully. So so I'm not suggesting something that's selfishly exclusive of all other people. I'm just saying is that if you don't know what your goals and meanings are, you might not ever do them in life because you're always doing somebody else's work. I was at a funeral about a month ago. The father of a really, really close friend of mine had passed away. And I got into town in the first few minutes I was there. My buddy sort of grabs me by the hand and he says, come with me, I want to show you something. And so we walk out across the yard to this huge outbuilding, big enough to put several large trucks in. I mean, it's a big, big, big thing. And it was a sculpture studio that he had built with his dad. His dad had done welding and heavy metal construction and cleaned water towers, refurbished water towers for a living, and had also worked as an electrician. And the guy was a really interesting sort of big, giant metal sculptor. And in his, would have been in his late 50s, early 60s, he and his son built this giant workshop that he could keep all his tools and his stuff in, but it was also basically an artist studio. And then it had a little room over here on the side that had a pool table and a bathroom. It was a cool building. And my buddy takes me out there and he says, yeah, man, Jeff, do what, you know how you're always talking about doing what's most important and doing the things that's most meaningful. He said, my dad and I got this built just in time for him to be too sick to use it. And so, without remembering what's most important, we can get to the end of our lives having had a good life, success, maybe a happy family, maybe all of those things. Maybe suffered the tragedies that we all suffer, but also a bunch of successes that we all struggle. But if there's most important things left on the table, then there is some way in which we're not paying attention. And of course, you can't do everything. So you have to make choices. But including whatever your most important goals are should be part of that collection of most important things. Here's one of the funny ones, and I like this one. This is my last at this point, and I'll move on to my other part of the talk here afterwards. Check my time, okay. Remember to just pass on crackpot ideas, fads, conspiracy theories, just whatever's trending, pass. Don't click the button, just pass. And that's because pop culture, even important parts of pop culture like politics and society and things like that, pop culture tends to run in a sensationalistic fashion. And so it is maximally designed to engage our attentions or to engage our fears. And they hire all the good young art students and sociology students and the psych students to work in their marketing department to make that true. Whoever they are. They get the best talent because they want you to pay attention to fashions, fads, trends, sensations, because they're going to sell you something, via that mechanism. And for a mature audience, that's easier for us to spot. But yeah, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. I'm a marketing category. I was trying to teach my nephews this principle, and they were going like, yeah, but Uncle Jeff, blah 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 blah. You do your own things, and you're not real worried about what other people think, and this, that, and the other. I said, no. I have an outline on a sheet. You can tell from the car I drive, the limited amount of media that I let my children watch, the level of my education, that I'm doing a mindfulness talk today. You know exactly what to sell me and what I'm not interested in, down to the kind of tea that I probably drink. And so none of us are immune to that. None of us. Because there's a giant machine that's built to run complex parts of the economy that are built on attracting your attention relative to tastes, fads, trends. And so, and then the crackpot side of that is that if, I don't know, here's a random example. If 97% of all scientists in the world think something, that's probably true. Or if 86% of all psychologists recommend this, that's probably true. Now again, that doesn't mean don't be skeptical, because part of paying attention, and again, step back to the other one, people are trying to sell you stuff. So those two things are in conflict. So part of paying attention is that you can't trust everything you hear. And so you have to look for big patterns. And you have to not make up your mind ahead of time. You have to be willing to revise your thinking. You have to realize that the big majority might be wrong. And then you have to rethink that. You have to realize that you don't know most of what we think we know. Either never really happened to us, or, it's just not mine, or is half pieces of information that are put together in a kind of Frankenstein monster kind of way. And so I tricked you on that one. Most of the time you can trust most of the people, most of the time, except when you can't. And the only way through that, it's just hard. The only way through that is to continue to educate yourself, pay attention, to not get distracted by just fads and trends and that kind of stuff. And so, a couple of practical exercises that I always teach everybody that I ever talk to mindfulness about, and that is, it's hard to be mindful about your whole life. Or when you say, Jeff, be mindful of my emotions, what do you mean by that? So I always teach people little simple exercises. And one of them is the next time you have something to read, get a pencil and a piece of paper and set a little non-obnoxious timer. Always with timers in our society, we use the timer that sounds like a submarine's about to sink. It's like, whoa, skip that timer. Get the one that goes ding. It's a piece of mindfulness. That's free advice. Set a timer for about 5 minutes. And every time, and when you're reading, every time that you find yourself reading the same paragraph because you don't know what it just said, daydreaming, going over your to-do list, every time anything like that happens, just put a little mark on the paper. Typically speaking, in 5 minutes, people will put 20 or 30 marks while they were reading. And so, if you discover that, then that means when you think you're reading, of course with my students, they said, but I read the book. And it's like, yeah, you had a book of it somewhere in the vicinity. Thought it was going to magically jump in your head. That's an exercise that will just show you how good your basic attention is. And one of the things is there are positive things of why we don't pay attention. For example, if you read something and then you stop to think about it, say you're reading something about the Vietnam War, and then that connects for you about things that are going on in Southeast Asia right now. That's not an unproductive act. Part of what we read to do is to think. But this is an exercise. This is to teach about if you think you're reading and you're not, you should be aware of it. You should know that about yourself. And then another one is if you eat past the point of being full, you weren't paying attention to your body because your body gives you a bunch of signals about that. Or if you drink past like the coffee example, if you drink 7 cups of coffee a day, then you completely ignored what your body was telling you relatively quickly because we metabolize coffee pretty quick. So, start doing that pretty quick. And I have a really good friend who was having heart palpitations, and he was worried because he's hitting middle age, and he went into the doctor, and the doctor's checking him out, and he's in pretty good health. And he's like, "How many cups of coffee do you drink?" He says, "Well, I drink 1 or 2 pots." And she says, "Well, why don't you cut down to 1 or 2 cups, and then let that go for about 3 weeks and see if you need to come back and see me or not." So it's a little mindfulness exercise, is that if you don't eat when you're hungry, or if you don't stop eating when you're full, that's one that everybody, you don't have to be philosophical. You don't have to be trained in psychology. You don't have to appreciate ancient traditions of Buddhism. Just to know I'm full. Oh yeah, okay. I wasn't paying attention. As opposed to, but I really like barbecue. And so those are 2 really, really easy mindfulness exercises to practice, which makes it sort of not, it's not esoteric or confusing or sort of too complicated. And that's mindfulness practices. They start with ordinary things. You start with ordinary things. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to jump to... Oh, I got to tell you one more. One more phrase. And being a mature audience, I mean, that just sounds so naughty. Being a mature audience, most of you know this, but I like to always include it in the talk because for a young audience, it's really an important piece of information. And I find that even with highly trained professionals, I work with other professors, and I notice some of them don't have this skill set that I'm about to describe sort of well established in their own mind. And that is, integrate the knowledge that you have with all the other knowledge you have. So if you ever met an MD who's a smoker, that's an example of someone who doesn't have 2 pieces of knowledge integrated. Something he or she knows, and then some other anxiety or reason or habit, whatever. And so there's knowledge over here that's not integrated with knowledge over there. If you find, one of those tweet storm Facebooky things where the things that I never click on, that my wife mentioned, and she said, "Look at this," and I was like, I don't look at things like that, but okay, that is interesting. And it was some significant researcher who was famous for all this psychological research into empathy, was notorious for being horrible to her research assistants and all the people she worked, like a real awful person. And I was like, yeah, that's not integrated. That's not integrated. We're just about out of time, so...
Jeff, say the phrase again that you said. Integrate the knowledge that you have.
Yeah, integrate the knowledge that you have across your lifestyle, or from, So a lot of times this kind of really sophisticated knowledge comes from our professional experience or educational experiences.
Okay.
And then we don't integrate that, say, into our everyday beliefs and habits.
Thank you.
You know, it's like, you know, a psychologist who can't get along with his kids. It's like, that doesn't make sense. Now, there are
Could
probably...
be termed also hypocrisy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's, and the thing about it is, yes, I know, it's 45 minutes. We have, although it comes out of our own Western ancient religious roots, classical religions, we have this notion of hypocrisy well developed exactly because we know that our knowledge should be integrated with our actions. And when that doesn't happen, we go, wait a minute. Something's fishy. And that's so deeply and sophisticatedly integrated across the history of Western culture that we already know that. But it's hard to practice because when it's your kids, it's easy to have blinders. Whenever you're trying to make money, you don't just pay attention to this thing over here. I mean, so we don't fail to integrate our knowledge across our life comprehensively, again, because it's often not a malicious thing. It's a not paying attention thing. So just a few minutes left, and then I'm going to take some questions. There's two different expressions in American culture of this mindfulness movement, and one of them comes from these ancient Indian traditions, particularly well developed in the Buddhist tradition, and then the other one comes from the mind-body medicine traditions of American medicine and psychology, and they're mostly identical. I brought a couple of books to just pass around. Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, has many publications. This little book, The Miracle of Mindfulness. This is a classic, thoroughly useful, practical guide that comes straight out of the tradition from which these ideas originate, and is a modern thinker. No, nominated for Nobel Prize, maybe won a Nobel Prize. I'd have to double check that, but a really interesting guy. And I'll just pass that around. You can take a look at it if you want. And this is a PhD, therapist, psychologist. There's no religious references in whatsoever. It's very clear from the author, some of the examples the author uses, that he's out of some kind of Christian background and is American, and has a psychological practice. And this sort of is called How to Want What You Have, which is a good phrase. And this is an example of mindfulness practices and mindfulness attitudes that are in a secular Western American context. And so I thought I'd just pass these around if you want to look at it, because there's these two different schools of thought in America. One of them that's, again, this kind of broadly applicable, secularized, psychological, social scientific set of attitudes that is picked up in the kind of simplify your life, focus your life, be more productive, reduce stress, you know, kind of medical set of attitudes. And then the other one is the Buddhist traditions, which have this as integrated to a much broader set of lifestyle changes. And I mentioned those two things because the Western medicine uses of mindfulness have been really thoughtful. So Western medicine has been really respectful to these practices and tried to understand them in a therapeutic laboratory condition. But for the most part, it's not really but, I just want to give you the focus here. The Western medical traditions in psychology have really focused on mindfulness to help us relieve stress and live healthier lives. That's the Western focus. The South Asian or the old Indian Buddhist focus is part of living an ethical life. And so for the Buddhists, one does all of this kind of thing because you have to be mindful and sort of in full possession of all your faculties in order to be good. And so the Buddhist side of this really does have an ethical and moral component. They think that you be mindful so that you can be kind and compassionate and helpful and give service to others. The Western medicine will touch on some of those kind of ethical issues, but much more likely is a health and happiness and stress reduction kind of attitude. So I wanted to add those two things, because if you found yourself sort of reading in this literature, you'll find that the tradition sort of splits in that kind of way. And with a lot of friendliness, because of course most of these MDs and psychologists learn mindfulness from Buddhist monks or yoga practitioners, especially Buddhist monks. Okay, well I got plenty more things. I could just keep talking and talking and talking, but I want to stop and let you guys ask any questions, and we can engage in any sort of chatting that you like. Yeah.
I'm reminded of a cover, I think it was on Life magazine, and it was showing the pathways, the man's mind versus the woman's mind. And the man, they're both sitting on a park bench, and he's got an axe in his hand, and she's sitting next to him reading with her child in the stroller, you know, with a cup of coffee by her hand. So I was just wondering about the different pathways, man's mind versus woman's mind. She's multitasking.
Yeah. There's a pretty well-developed psychological literature that women can multitask because the evolutionary history of how women take care of a community always, and then have whatever their own activities are, selects better for this kind of, so it's like women can multitask and men really can't. And the brain science on that is considerably more ambiguous, because our brains shape themselves according to our culture and our habits. And so I meant to bring a magic marker, but I can sort of draw it in the air. And that is, if you have a single set of neuron connections in a synapse, if you do an activity, that starts to get bigger, and it starts to branch, and it branches and branches, and it connects. And those connections in practical terms, because it's, it just looks like trees and roots and all that stuff. In practical connections, what we're talking about is how we fuse concepts and actions together. So for us, if we have an idea and it connects to another idea, that's a connection. And so the beliefs we have and the body-brain that we have are the same thing. And that's not the metaphor we tend to operate with in our society. And our society is wrong about it, at least according to neuroscientists. And that is, we build our brain out of our society. And so it's true in our society that women can multitask better than men. And that is because we have a society that values them doing that and rewards them for it. And it's a society that rewards males for going out and chasing bad guys or chopping down trees or sort of committing all their resources into usually a breadwinning activity. And part of the kind of neuroscience evidence that we have for that is that if you look at Buddhist nuns and Buddhist monks' brains and an fMRI, they look the same. They're not different at all. And they have really highly developed areas that in us is real strong, which have to do with integrating emotions. And so that calm, here's the thing my students do all the time. It's like, oh, my Buddhists are all calm and everything all the time. They sort of think of it as kind of a sort of sort of like, oh, I'm so mellow. It's like Buddhists have all the same emotions that everybody else has. They just don't freak out as much as all the Buddhists. They have all the same emotions. And in fact, if you do these meditation or mindful practices, I would argue, and there's some evidence for this, although it's complicated, I would argue that being in full possession of your attention and your memory and your body makes you able to experience your emotions very deeply and powerfully. And again, but without freaking out all the time. And so instead of becoming less emotional, you become more emotional. And I write somewhat about this neuroscience stuff because I'm fascinated by how these meditation practices change our brain. And that's, I guess, the final bit of punchline. And that is, if a person were to take up these practices in their life, if we did an MRI before and after, they would change their brain at any point in their life. Because your body and brain function slows down. It isn't, like little kids are like starfish. If they break their leg, it'll end up longer than the other one. And so all of our processes slow down and are more easily damaged, are more vulnerable to toxins. But it is not the case that our brains stop making connections. That happens for as long as you're alive, if you have challenging activities that you engage in. And so, for example, with the brain science and this mindfulness stuff, there's no time it's too late to start. And so, does that give a good answer to the question? Any other questions?
That has an interesting concept then about dementia, about what's happening with us scientifically around what we're experiencing in our, I guess, in our culture, and people really very close to their lifestyles experience with aging, the loss of memory.
Yeah.
There's
a therapeutic program in California that's using very, very strict diet, mindfulness practices, meditation practices, and a safe, wholesome, but consistent amount of physical exercise, especially cardiovascular, that's showing some really good results with dementia patients, unlike what we get with medications. And so, and there's, again, we don't know. This is one of the problems. We don't know the answers to all this stuff. But one of the reasons we think that we see more cognitive decline is not the most common thing people say, which is not, it's a variable that can be excluded, is that, well, people live longer now. And so it's just a natural part of growing old, and we have better, people live much longer. That's not true. If you don't eat right, you don't sleep enough, and here's what it is it's a toxic effect in which if you are stressed out for 50 years or 70 years, it will break your brain. Now, there are also genetic, there's genetic issues, and there's also buildup of heavy metals, and I mean, there's a number of other issues. Our environment's more toxic, just in terms of, like we all have more plastic in our bodies today than anybody did, when The Graduate was in the theaters. Plastics. And so there's more than one thing going on. But, well, they did these really interesting studies with Roman Catholic nuns that were living well over 100 and with very low cases of any kind of cognitive decline. And they played games all the time. They played Scrabble. They did crossword puzzles. They engaged in socializing with each other. They sang. They had this regimented lifestyle where they talked to each other. And they really saw those kind of things, is if you remember that stereotype, it certainly was a stereotype in my childhood, of that it's wintertime and it's cold outside, so me and my mom are doing a puzzle on a big table, or we played board games all the time. That those kinds of things, it's not just something to be sentimental and nostalgia about, but those are the kind of things that keep your brain active, that sort of challenge you to look for patterns, to kind of do mental calisthenics. And some of these little apps that like people have for their phones and things like that, these mental exercise sort of games, some of that stuff's pretty good. Some of it's gimmicky, but if that were combined with actually talking to other human beings regularly, and just some walking and all those kinds of things, and then these mindfulness exercises are definitely good for you. And I mean, there's decades of so it's not just these traditional groups that say it's good for you. It's that all this medicine that sort of bears that out. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
I've got this friend who's constantly frustrated because he thinks he can predict the future. And, you know, he's forever, it's kind of like, he's not mindful because he's always living in the future and not the present. He's saying, well, this is what's going to happen. And it never happens that way. And I just wonder how much of the frustration of the modern period is that we all think we can predict the future. And you know, and so he's not living in the moment. He's not being present at all. He's completely ignoring the present and saying, well, this is how it's going to work out.
You know, really one of the only difference between us as human beings and other mammals, because we have, in terms of body brain, you know, we're us and all mammals share a lot. We share more than is different about us. But one of the things that's really different about human beings is, and it's a frontal lobe issue if you're interested in brain science. One of the things about human beings that's this thing that made us most effective at exploiting all the resources of this entire planet, of creating all the history of art and literature, of all of it, is that we have this ability to imagine what we can't imagine, and then try to do it. My cats or dogs are smart. They miss me when I'm gone. They understand things. If you look into a creature's eye and you know something's looking back at you, that's a being that has emotions and thoughts. But my dog can't curse the day he was born. He can think and feel, and he's a person in dog and canine terms, but he can't imagine what he can't imagine. We can't. And so that allows us to predict into the future further than later, which is what a dog understands later. But a dog doesn't understand 10 years from now, I'm going to be. The powerful visualization and imagination it takes to do that activity is a special human thing. We can also remember more complicatedly into the past. So far in the past that I'm giving you a talk today that's based on some teachings of a teacher who lived 2,500 years ago. Now that is longer ago than my dog can live. And so this skill, this being able to imagine what we can't imagine, is the source of all of our creativity and all of our ingenuity, all of our invention, all of it. It is also a trap because it is the basis of fantasy and crackpot stuff. Because if you can imagine what you can imagine, if you can imagine what you can't imagine, then you could imagine that Dick Cheney was a robot. I saw that on a grocery store. It was like you fire one of those. And I don't know what the article said, but I've always liked that fantasy. Or that, you know, aliens are secretly controlling the world. Or, you know, if the same thing that gives us our abilities to do everything that's amazing same thing that's going on. That we have Shakespeare is also why we have fake news. It's the same thing. And so that's part, again, of why you pay attention, because you got to sort that stuff out. And it's hard. But if you're paying attention, you have more energy to do hard things. So there's that too.
One of the best books I've read in a long time is the biography of the Wright brothers. There is a prime example of how they used their imagination, their foresight, and just pursued it until they learned how to fly.
Well, you guys know they were bicycle.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah. So I love those guys.
Well, that was the high technology.
Yeah. Is anybody, I mean, of course, I know this is way before any of our times, probably 100 years or more, but has anybody ever been on the top one of those great big bicycles with a giant first wheel? I had a buddy of mine who worked in a carnival, and so I can't imagine that was the bicycle we first thought of as human beings. It's got a wheel that's like this tall. I mean, you got to climb up on a ladder to get onto it. I guess they were maybe, I don't know.
I'm just having a statement or question. I've practiced Tai Chi for many, many years.
Yes.
And to me, that's like a
Yes.
thing of mindfulness,
Yeah.
because you have to concentrate on one thing, on that one move.
Yes, and in fact, if we lived in a culture that had organic and natural practices of mindfulness, as opposed to, like we did in the West, is we read a book and then we take it up and we're like, but if we lived in a kind of an organic society in which these things were integrated into the society, we would teach little kids Tai Chi and basic meditation exercises of just the deep relaxation kind. And I mean, preschool. And that is, and so because those movements and, all that, the kind of paying attention. We used to do that is when American PE in school looked like everybody running out there in white T-shirts and gym shorts, and my high school still had all the bow and arrows from whatever national program that was. We weren't allowed to play with them anymore, but our old phys ed, mid 20th century phys ed tradition had some of this built into it. You teach archery because that's an attention thing. Everybody runs and does obstacle courses. But in China, in Chinese derivative cultures, Tai Chi is a basic mindfulness training exercise because it teaches all this stuff in one sort of routine activity and is, it's good for you. It relaxes you. It teaches this, you kind of have to pay attention. Anything that has choreography teaches attention. So back when everybody danced steps, when you learn steps as opposed to just freestyle dancing, that taught this. And so I think our society naturally had a bunch of mindfulness practices at a former time, sort of almost was already out of fashion by the time I was born and was a small child. From a mindfulness perspective, we ought to still make children memorize thousands of lines of poetry, of course, yes. Because that's actually attention building. It teaches a kind of attention. And so that kind of classic mid-20th century education system taught a lot of this stuff as kind of a byproduct. Educators often know this stuff. You talk to a little teacher who has a lifetime of experience, especially if they work with kids. They'll know all these things. Well, you got to get them up and moving. You give them some dance steps, make them memorize some stuff, breathe, count. Anything else? How are we doing? I guess you guys can just. I'll quit talking and you guys quit asking questions.
It is
just a little concerning to me, especially with their little grandchildren, how they're just so into their video games or their tablets or iPads, and they really don't want to go out and play. And they were visiting us, and we forced them to go on some hikes. I mean, and they
That sounds
actually
shocking.
enjoyed it, but they
Yeah.
wanted that constant, it was like a constant need to get onto their, any social media, any game, versus just taking in the outdoors,
Yeah.
and listening to birds and all this. And I
Yeah.
think that's a concern. You've probably seen a big difference teaching.
Yeah, in the Buddhist, and then the Tai Chi is inspired by Taoism, which is the Chinese tradition, which values mindfulness very profoundly. The South and East Asian traditions that have these mindfulness things in this larger ethical framework of sort of a whole life, all of them include, oh yeah, go outdoors. That's a religious obligation. You know, it's like, okay, tell the truth, be truthful, don't steal things, spend time outdoors, and you go like, oh, I didn't remember that one from the list, you know. And so, technology has a number of uses that is good for our brains. So in fact, if you have an elderly shut-in, for example, who can play, who's got nobody to play Scrabble with, who can play Words with Friends with their nephew across the country, and also look at the pictures of the grandkids. So the tech is weird, it's interesting, because there's all these kinds of things that are good for us. It's part of it. But I think one of the problems is we give it to children too young, without limits. And because they don't have all the other habits yet. And so I think technology is a really powerful and meaningful thing for which there are many creative and instructive uses. And I think we ought to treat it in the same way that we would treat a lawnmower or a chainsaw. Really useful tool that you can use for all kinds of important stuff. Or, you know, but probably not something to leave small children access to unrestricted. Powerful thing. You know, we don't give kids matches. Matches are useful for all kinds of reasons.
Well, one of the things too is how a lot of cars now have TV, and kids can watch us. And when I was a kid, it was fun to go on a trip because you looked out the windows and you saw all kinds of things. And are they even paying any attention to the outside world? That's how you learn.
I think a lot of that. I've got two small. I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and one of the things, and my wife's van has a video player in it, and we've got a rule, and that is, if you're taking an hour trip, you can have 10 minutes of video, usually right at the end when you're about to lose your mind. If you're taking a 12-hour trip, if that's broken over 2 days, you can have 2 hours a day. And so that's the way we've moderated that, is that it's such a pervasive part of the culture. I don't want, for example, I don't want my kids not to know how to interact with an iPad or a similar device, because that's a skill set. But they can have it for 2 hours, and that's it. And it's all. And I'm also really clear. They basically do not have unrestricted access to television, or they can't just do what they want. They've got, you know, some little educational programs, and they can watch some daddy-approved videos. And there's a very small, actually old British children's preschool is pretty much the best preschool you can get, you know, like television you can get, or even the new stuff that's European. There's some really good stuff. All the brightly colored, chaotic American stuff is, not sure. But, and so that's the adults, not the kids. And that's because the adults are subject to these same forces, and they're distracted and confused. Because if you just stand up to your kids and say, yeah, your 2 hours is up and that's it, you have to get through that losing your mind period, and you do that a few times, and they readjust. If you find yourself. But yeah, that's the lack of mindfulness on the adult's part, and also it's part of the whole addiction that all of us are faced with, which older people are actually have more tools to deal with media. Because, I mean, I'm easily old enough to remember whenever there was 3 channels. And that was it. And so there wasn't stuff you wanted to watch on all the time. That's the other thing, yeah, just went to a blank screen. And so, because, and this is what, here, this is a history of science issue. And that is, human societies invent something amazing, and they have no idea how to deal with it. And that happened with the automobile, happened with the printing press. I mean, this has happened again and again and again and again and again throughout history. As we can imagine and invent stuff that we don't know how to handle. And then we go through this extremely uncomfortable adjustment period. And we do a bad job, and then we start figuring it out and sort of putting it together. And I think we're in that adjustment period. So I think kids 10 years from now, that parents might have a better handle on. Oh yeah, we can't give them unrestricted access to cable TV for 24/7 via a handheld device a supercomputer that they can carry in their pocket. And that there's a problem with that. And of course, there's all kinds of people who already know that. It's just it needs to sort of permeate more broadly throughout the culture. And I think that's a kind of sensibility that we'll have to deal with and figure out. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruth. We really appreciate it. Our next Tuesday talk on September 11th at the Woodlands is going to be a presentation on lessons of engineering, design, and ethics from the collapse of the World Trade Center. And so hopefully you can make it out for that. Just a couple reminders, if you didn't sign in as you came in, please do so as you go. And don't forget to sign up for the fall classes. It'll be first come, first served on the seats available for each of those. And I'll be sticking around if you have any questions about that. I'll be happy to answer. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.